Demanding to be declared innocent in the Ukraine scandal, President Trump is slamming House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's decision to hang on to the articles of impeachment while negotiations continue over the upcoming trial in the Senate. The president tweeted, "Actually, they have zero proof of anything. They will never even show up. They want out. I want an immediate trial." Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, told young conservatives at the Turning Point USA summit, Democrats are out for blood.
They want to put Barr in prison, and they want to execute me. Good luck. I just get angrier and I go after you more.
The president's daughter, Ivanka, concedes her father is upset.
Angry at the waste of time, angry at the collateral damage, angry, but it's still energizing, and it focuses you on, really, and draws into relief the stark contrast in priorities.
That will be in order.
But Pelosi appears to be getting in some digs of her own, inviting the president to deliver the State of the Union around the time of Mr. Trump's trial, writing in a letter, "In the spirit of respecting our Constitution."
All right, people, welcome back. Dr. John is here. So what just happened, guys? At last night's press conference, Trump's carefully constructed facade of unstoppable force crumbled as security closed in, revealing a president finally confronted by the constitutional machinery he spent years trying to dismantle. The moment was a catastrophe, exposing something far more unsettling than any political defeat. The scene unfolded with all the drama of a Hollywood thriller, except this wasn't fiction. This was the reality of a presidency careening toward its most dangerous moment yet. The president took the stage with his characteristic bravado, that swagger that had carried him through scandals that would have destroyed any other political figure. But something was different this time. The usual fire was there, but it was tinged with something else. Desperation, perhaps, or the dawning realization that the legal walls were closing in faster than anyone had anticipated. What happened next wasn't just a press conference gone wrong, it was a constitutional earthquake that sent shockwaves through every corner of American political life.
I invite you to deliver your State of the Union address before a joint session of Congress on Tuesday, February 4th, 2020. But an expert witness for the Democrats during the inquiry is warning Pelosi should get on with it, writing in an op-ed, if the House does not communicate its impeachment to the Senate, it hasn't actually impeached the president. Democrats aren't buying that.
Absolutely. After the vote that we took on the floor and, the majority of Congress voted to impeach the president, he has absolutely been impeached.
As Christmas is approaching, the president is all but saying bah humbug to the religious publication Christianity Today, which is calling for Mr. Trump's removal over his actions in Ukraine. The president blasted the website as a far-left magazine, but that's not true, according to its editor.
It's factually inaccurate that we're far left. We're pretty centrist. We rarely comment on politics unless we feel it rises to the level of some national or concern that is really important, and that this would be a case.
Mr. Trump tweeted, "The fact is, no president has ever done what I have done for evangelicals or religion itself."
The president, visibly agitated from the moment he stepped behind the podium, launched into a tirade that would have been shocking even by his standards. His words came faster, more frantic, the carefully calibrated chaos giving way to something raw and more dangerous. "The Democrats are out for blood," he declared, his voice cracking with barely suppressed fury. "They want to put Barron in prison, and they want to execute me." The reference to his youngest son was calculated, a desperate attempt to humanize himself by painting his political opponents as monsters who would destroy his family. But the strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of sympathy, it generated something far more damaging, the uncomfortable realization that the president was genuinely terrified, that the legal pressure was finally getting to him in ways that no amount of bravado could mask. "Good luck," he continued, his voice taking on an almost manic quality. "I just get angrier and I go after you more." It was the threat of a cornered animal, and everyone watching could feel the desperation bleeding through the performance.
But while the president is popular among Christian conservatives, he rarely attends church and has at times puzzled his own faithful, whether by signing Bibles or misquoting passages from the scripture.
2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17. That's the whole ballgame.
Now, the president is tweeting about House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. We can put this up on screen, insisting she should be impeached for demanding a fair trial in the Senate. And even with all of that friction tonight, the president has accepted Pelosi's invitation to deliver that State of the Union in early February. But that could be messy if the president's impeachment trial is still underway. At the moment, House Democrats are planning for a trial in early January, despite this current delay. And next, the president is off to Mar-a-Lago. He does that later on this evening for his winter vacation. administration will be celebrating the holidays and making one resolution for the new year: exoneration. Wolf.
Jim Acosta at the White House, thank you. Let's get some more on all of this. Democratic Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut is joining us. He's a key member of the Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. And as you saw, the president says Nancy Pelosi is looking for a quid pro quo, his words, with the Senate. What's your reaction?
Behind the scenes, the family dynamics were equally telling. Ivanka Trump, the president's daughter and one of his most trusted advisors, was reportedly trying to calm the situation, but even she couldn't hide the strain. In conversations with close associates, she conceded that her father was genuinely upset, not just at the legal setbacks, but at what she described as the waste of time and the collateral damage. The family was under siege, she suggested, and the president was struggling to process the magnitude of the constitutional assault on his administration. But even in her attempts to present a unified front, there was an unmistakable edge of frustration. This wasn't just political theater anymore. This was survival. The legal reality that had triggered this meltdown was more complex than any single Supreme Court ruling could capture. But one decision stood above all others in its sheer audacity and constitutional significance.
Well, it's nonsense, Wolf. The president is raging because for the very first time in his life, he has been held accountable for his actions. Actions that were plain for everyone to see, that he held up military aid, that he held up a White House meeting, that he just wanted a favor. And that favor, of course, was an announced investigation into his political opponent. And so for the first time in his life, this president is being held accountable. He, of course, is being completely defended by those complicit in his presidency, my Republican colleagues and his family, who are trying to flip this back around to be a problem with the Democrats. Remember, this impeachment was not about the Democrats. It was about the president's behavior, and it also didn't waste any time at all. I'm a little exhausted at the end of this week because while the impeachment occurred, we also passed a massive trade agreement. We passed a budget to prevent the government from being shut down. We passed a bill to reduce pharmaceutical and drug prices for the American people. So what you're seeing, Wolf, here is a president who, for the very first time in his life, is being held accountable, and boy, he does not like that.
As you know, Professor Noah Feldman, a Harvard Law School constitutional scholar, who was a key witness, by the way.
The court's ruling in Trump versus United States had fundamentally rewritten the rules of presidential accountability, but not in the way that the president's defenders or detractors had anticipated. Instead of providing a shield for the president's conduct, the ruling had created a paradox that would come back to haunt him in ways that no one had fully appreciated at the time. The court's decision granting presidents absolute immunity for the exercise of core constitutional powers and presumptive immunity for all other official acts was described by legal analysts across the political spectrum as the most consequential expansion of presidential legal protection in American constitutional history. ABC News called it a watershed moment that would reshape the presidency for generations.
For the Democrats, says President Trump isn't actually impeached until this moves over to the Senate. The articles of impeachment are actually sent over from the House to the Senate. How do you respond to his analysis?
Well, I'm not a constitutional scholar. I'm not even a lawyer, but I will tell you I can read the Constitution. The Constitution says the House has the sole power to impeach. Two articles passed on this week, and it's not clear to me that there's anything out there that says it has to be conveyed to the Senate. And, you know, look, it's very clear what Nancy Pelosi is doing here. It is equally clear that the president doesn't understand that it is congressional authority to decide how this will proceed. You know, you had Mitch McConnell, who is running the Senate, say, and I quote him on this, "I'm not at all impartial." Now remember, Mitch McConnell is a juror in this trial. In any other court, in any part of the land, a juror who said, "I am not impartial," would be shown the door very, very quickly. So all the Speaker is trying to do here is to make sure that this is, in fact, a trial.
NPR described it as a fundamental transformation of the relationship between the executive branch and the criminal justice system. But here was the cruel irony that the president was only beginning to understand. The very immunity that was supposed to protect him had become the mechanism that was now threatening to destroy him. The specific immunity ruling had established a framework that made it harder, not easier, to prosecute Trump for the most consequential categories of conduct. Core presidential powers were absolutely protected. Official acts were presumptively immune unless prosecutors could make the nearly impossible showing that the conduct was private rather than official. But here was the twist that the administration had failed to anticipate. The same legal framework that protected Trump from criminal prosecution also empowered the lower courts to scrutinize his conduct with unprecedented rigor. The specific prosecutorial burden created by the immunity ruling was the most consequential immediate action demanded by the decision. Federal and state prosecutors most directly seeking to prosecute Trump for official conduct now had to demonstrate that specific conduct was private rather than official before the immunity protection could be overcome. That specific prosecutorial burden was the most consequential immediately demanded action, whose specific difficulty most directly determines how effective the specific immunity protection is in practice for the specific categories of conduct most urgently relevant to Trump's most serious criminal exposure. But the immunity ruling was only one piece of the puzzle, and perhaps not even the most damaging one when viewed through the lens of the president's immediate political survival. The same court that had expanded presidential immunity had also delivered a series of devastating policy defeats that were, in many ways, more immediately threatening to Trump's political position than any criminal prosecution could be. The tariff ruling, the National Guard deployment limits, and the ballot disqualification decision had combined to create a constitutional trap from which there was no easy escape. The tariff ruling was particularly devastating. The specific irreversible constitutional determination that the emergency powers law does not authorize comprehensive tariff setting and that Congress must clearly approve such major economic moves had effectively ended the administration's most ambitious trade policy agenda. This wasn't just a policy defeat. It was a fundamental reordering of the constitutional balance of power that left the administration scrambling for alternatives. The fate of unilateral EPA tariff authority as the primary trade policy instrument was permanently sealed. And Trump's public fury at the ruling, calling the six-justice majority fools and lapdogs and describing the decision as catastrophic for American power, was the most authentic confirmation of how devastating the defeat truly was. The National Guard deployment ruling was equally consequential, though in different ways. The specific court ruling holding that the legal conditions for Trump's attempt to federalize the National Guard for domestic law enforcement in Chicago were not met, and reaffirming the specific limits on domestic military deployment, including posse comitatus, established a constitutional barrier that would constrain the administration's domestic military ambitions for the remainder of the presidency. The specific constitutional line most urgently redrawn in the specific accountability action, most directly constraining the specific, most alarming available application of military force in the domestic political context. And then there was the ballot disqualification ruling, the decision that legal analysts described as a significant political win for Trump, but that ultimately revealed the deeper constitutional contradictions at the heart of the accountability story. The court's determination that only Congress, not states, can enforce the 14th Amendment's insurrection disqualification to remove candidates from state ballots had kept Trump on all state ballots, preventing the most immediately available mechanism for state-level accountability. But the ruling had also raised uncomfortable questions about the constitutional design of the insurrection disqualification mechanism and why the judicial determination preventing that mechanism's practical availability at the state level was as consequentially alarming for the accountability question it foreclosed as any other Supreme Court determination in the accumulated accountability record. The paradox at the heart of the Supreme Court's Trump-era decisions is the most alarming constitutional contradiction in modern American political history. The same court, in substantially overlapping terms and with substantially overlapping majorities, simultaneously expanded the most important legal shield against criminal prosecution and constrained specific policy tools in ways that created the most dramatic possible range of outcomes across the most different available accountability dimensions. The specific simultaneous expansion and contraction is the constitutional accountability story, most urgently requiring the honest map that the most dramatic single direction seals fate forever, framing most directly prevents by collapsing the specific paradox into the most immediately alarming single-direction narrative. The immunity ruling protects Trump from criminal prosecution for the most consequential categories of official conduct. The specific exercises of presidential authority whose specific consequences are the most alarming available applications of the most powerful available presidential tools, including using the Justice Department for personal ends, are protected by absolute immunity for core constitutional powers. The tariff ruling constrains the most consequential available unilateral economic policy tool, the specific mechanism most urgently enabling the most ambitious trade policy agenda. The president who is most protected from criminal accountability for his official conduct is simultaneously the president whose specific most important unilateral trade policy tool has been constitutionally foreclosed by the same court in substantially overlapping terms with substantially overlapping majorities. This simultaneous maximum criminal protection and specific policy tool foreclosure is the specific most accurately alarming description of the court's simultaneous nuclear moves in both directions. The paradox is as alarming in its constitutional implications as any single seal's fate forever framing can describe in its most dramatically one-directional accountability narrative. Understanding that paradox, the simultaneous expansion of the most important criminal protection and contraction of the most important unilateral trade tool is the most important single accountability insight for any content most honestly engaging with the Supreme Court framing in its most completely grounded and most credibly positioned real-world accountability application. The specific immediate action demanded by each ruling reveals the real-world implications with uncomfortable clarity. The immunity ruling demanded specific action from federal and state prosecutors, most directly seeking to prosecute Trump for official conduct, requiring them to demonstrate that specific conduct is private rather than official before the immunity protection can be overcome. The tariff ruling demanded action from the administration, requiring it to either pursue congressional authorization for specific trade policy objectives or accept the specific policy limitations the constitutional determination imposes. The National Guard deployment ruling reaffirmed the constitutional constraints on domestic military deployment, establishing a precedent that would govern every future attempt to federalize military forces for domestic law enforcement. But perhaps the most alarming element of the full accountability picture is the ballot disqualification ruling's specific political accountability significance. The court's determination that only Congress can enforce the 14th Amendment's insurrection disqualification prevents the most immediately available mechanism for state-level accountability from being deployed in the most immediately threatening available accountability application. The 14th Amendment's insurrection disqualification is a specific constitutional provision most directly relevant to the accountability question of whether conduct directly characterized as insurrection-related most urgently disqualifies the most directly implicated person from the most consequential available political office. The court's determination that only Congress can enforce that provision at the state level is the judicial determination preventing the most urgently available state-level enforcement mechanism from being deployed. The resignation dynamics, the specific way in which political calls for resignation intensified by court defeats, are real and alarming, while legal requirements for resignation are specifically absent from any available judicial ruling, are the most urgently relevant accountability accuracy distinction. Political pressure for resignation is a real and consequential dimension of the accountability story. The specific political dynamic most urgently generated by the accumulated court defeats, whose impact on the political coalition most directly supporting continued presidential tenure, is the most consequentially alarming political accountability mechanism available outside the formal constitutional removal processes, is genuine and powerful. But political pressure is not legal command, and the distinction between the political and legal accountability mechanisms is the most important accuracy distinction. The specific most consequential single Supreme Court ruling most directly relevant to Trump's fate is the immunity ruling, whose specific most alarming accountability direction is the expansion of protection rather than the sealing of any fate whose most alarming consequence is resignation. The honest flip most urgently required reveals the court's actual most consequential fate-sealing ruling in its most precisely inverted accountability direction, while explaining the specific paradox that makes the full court accountability landscape more more alarming than any single direction narrative can describe. The fate is sealed, just not in the direction the most dramatic framing imagines. The immunity expansion is the most alarming fate sealing in the documented Supreme Court record. The policy defeats are real and consequential in their specific domains, and the paradox of simultaneous maximum criminal protection and specific policy tool foreclosure is the most alarming constitutional accountability story of the Trump-era court in its most completely described and most honestly grounded real-world form. The full picture of the Supreme Court's mixed Trump-era decisions, the immunity expansion, the tariff defeat, the National Guard limits, the ballot protection, and the specific political rather than legal resignation dynamics means something specific for the accountability story. An honest engagement with the Trump resignation inevitable as Supreme Court delivers ruling sealing his fate forever. Framing helps audiences understand the constitutional landscape. The first thing to understand is the inversion most precisely characterizing the most consequential single Supreme Court ruling most directly relevant to Trump's fate. The immunity ruling most directly seals the most important legal protection against criminal prosecution rather than sealing any accountability fate whose most alarming consequence is resignation. That inversion is the most urgently required honest qualification for the most credibly positioned engagement with the seal's fate forever framing. The second thing to understand is the paradox most accurately describing the full court accountability picture. The same court that struck down IEPA tariffs, blocked the Chicago National Guard deployment, and sent the election subversion case back to lower courts also gave Trump the most expansive criminal immunity in American presidential legal history and kept him on all state ballots. That paradox is more alarming in its full constitutional implications than either the comprehensive fate-sealing defeat or the comprehensive protection narrative can describe because it captures the constitutional reality of a court that is simultaneously constraining specific policy tools and expanding specific legal protections in ways that together constitute the most alarming available constitutional accountability landscape for the most urgently relevant accountability questions. The third thing to understand is the content opportunity the resignation inevitable seals fate forever Supreme Court framing creates for honest and consequential accountability content. The court has delivered rulings whose combined policy impact is as alarming for specific agenda elements as the seal's fate framing describes. The immunity expansion is the honest flip most urgently required. The court's actual most consequential fate-sealing ruling most precisely moved in the protection direction rather than the resignation direction. And the paradox of simultaneous constraint and protection is the most alarming available honest description of the full court accountability landscape. The most credibly grounded accountability story, the most dramatically alarming framing most urgently creates the opportunity to honestly tell is what the Trump resignation inevitable as Supreme Court delivers rulings sealing his fate forever framing ultimately captures. The dramatic energy of the accumulated Supreme Court decisions most urgently affecting the most consequential dimensions of Trump's constitutional position is real. The tariff defeat, the National Guard limits, the election subversion case remand, and the ballot protection decision compressed into the most immediately alarming single fate-sealing resignation inevitable form. The fate sealed by the tariff ruling is the fate of unilateral tariff authority. The fate sealed by the immunity ruling in the most precisely opposite direction is the fate of the most serious available criminal prosecution for the most consequential official conduct categories. The resignation is the political trajectory most directly intensified by the accumulated policy defeats. And the legal command that resignation is inevitable is the dramatic compression whose absence from the formal legal consequences of any specific Supreme Court ruling is the most urgently required honest qualification. The accountability story, the resignation inevitable seals fate forever framing, most urgently creates the opportunity to tell, is the story of the most paradoxical constitutional accountability landscape in the modern American presidential record. A court that sealed the fate of tariff authority while simultaneously sealing the fate of the most serious available criminal prosecution approach that blocked the Chicago National Guard deployment while simultaneously keeping Trump on all state ballots. And that set the election subversion case back for official versus private conduct determinations, while simultaneously establishing the most expansive presidential immunity doctrine in American legal history. Each specific element of that paradox is as alarming as the most dramatic framing can describe in its specific domain, and the combined constitutional landscape is more alarming in its full paradoxical implications than any single fate-sealing framing can describe. The resignation dynamics are real. The political pressure intensified by accumulated court defeats is genuine and consequential. The policy defeats are permanent and as devastating as the court's most alarming accountability actions can produce in their specific domains. But the most consequential single Supreme Court ruling most directly relevant to Trump's fate is the immunity ruling whose most alarming accountability direction is the expansion of protection, rather than the sealing of any fate whose most alarming consequence is resignation. The most credibly positioned and the most honestly grounded content using the fate-sealing hook is the content that says all of that most clearly, delivering the honest flip that reveals the court's actual most consequential fate-sealing ruling in its most precisely inverted accountability direction, while explaining the paradox that makes the full court accountability landscape more alarming than any single direction narrative can describe. The fate is sealed, just not in the direction the most dramatic framing imagines. The immunity expansion is the most alarming fate sealing in the documented Supreme Court record. The policy defeats are real and consequential in their specific domains. And the paradox of simultaneous maximum criminal protection and specific policy tool foreclosure is the most alarming constitutional accountability story of the Trump-era court. The ballot protection decision, the court's determination that only Congress can enforce the 14th Amendment's insurrection disqualification, is the most alarming additional element of the full paradox for audiences most urgently seeking the most complete available accountability map. The same court that struck down tariffs and blocked the Chicago deployment also prevented state-level insurrection disqualification from removing Trump from ballots. Each ruling addresses a specific accountability question in the specific domain most urgently relevant to the concern it most directly resolves. And the full map of all of them together, the immunity expansion, the tariff defeat, the National Guard limits, the ballot protection, and the election subversion remand, is the most completely described and most alarming available constitutional accountability landscape in the Trump-era court record. The most alarming ruling is the one that protected him most. The fate-sealing designation applies most accurately to the immunity expansion in its most precisely inverted accountability direction. And the content that maps the full paradox is the content that most credibly and most completely delivers the accountability story the dramatic single-direction framing is most urgently reaching toward in its most cinematically immediate and most emotionally alarming accountability description.